Okay, good evening everyone. Good to Moed. Now, don't be alarmed by the topic. This is not a Shalom Bayis shir. Rabbi Wickler will deal with that. And I don't advise using weapons as a way of encouraging men to help for Pesach. That's not the purpose of today's shir. Actually, there was once one particular husband who was not very helpful. And he could never get it right. So she says to him, do me a favor. I'm not asking you to help. I don't want you to clean. I don't want you to sweep. I don't want you to search. Just stay out of my hair. Just get out of the house. You get out of the house. I'll do what I have to do. And that's your job. So he's not really sure what to do. So he leaves the house. He goes to the bakery. He buys a muffin. He buys a Danish. He buys a donut. He buys a coffee. He heads to the Beis Medrash. He's not quite sure what to do or what direction to hold the sefer. After about 15 minutes, he figures out how to hold the sefer. He's looking at it. It's looking back at him. There's not much going on between him and the sefer. And after about 45 solid minutes of complete nothingness, he slowly meanders back to the house. She says, I thought I told you, you don't have to do anything, just get out of the house. He says, the whole day I have to help you? Anyway, that joke is not connected to tonight's share. Okay, tonight we're going to speak about women and weapons. Is a woman allowed to bear arms? Can she enlist in the American Army? Could she enlist in the IDF? Can a woman bear arms for self-defense? Could a woman bear arms as a security guard? That's the topic for tonight's share. Very interestingly, it begins with a simple pasuk in Chumash. Lo yiyah chli gever al isha, v'lo yilbash gever simla asisha. Literally, a garb of a man cannot be on a woman, and a man cannot wear a woman's garb. So, literally, the pasuk means that a man cannot wear a woman's clothing and a woman cannot wear man's clothing. The Targum on the spot says that it's not really referring to dressing as the other gender. The Targum says, Lo yihi sikun zain digvar alitza, that a weapon of a man cannot be donned by a woman, v'lisakin gvar kasikune yitza, and a man cannot adorn himself with the adornments or the accessories of a woman. So Targum is reading Pshuto Shel Mikra, that the pasuk is saying that a woman cannot bear arms, that somehow by bearing arms is considered a manly type of presentation, and therefore it is forbidden for a woman to bear arms. This is an Isser D'Oraisa. It seemingly would be a lav sheyesh by maisa, which, in other words, if she was warned not to do it, one could be liable to malchus. Rashi, interestingly, says, what's the reason for this? And it's important to bear this in mind for later in the shir. Shetehei doimel ish. Why would a woman bear arms? Because she wants to be similar to a man. To do what? Kedei shatelech bein ha'anashim. To be able to mix in male company. She'ein zu ela l'shem niyaf. The purpose of it is for promiscuity, for illicit type of behavior. If you look in the Gemara on the second sheet, the Gemara basically says what Targum says, which is very interesting. I believe this is a rare instance where Targum Onkelos interprets the literal meaning of the pasuk the way the Gemara darshans the pasuk. In other words, normally we wouldn't say that when a Gemara makes a drasha that's pshuto shel mikra. You normally say that's what we call exegesis. This is the Gemara's drasha. There's a level of pshuto shel mikra, which Targum tries to bring down pshuto shel mikra, the literal or simple reading of the pasuk, and the Gemara darshans. But this is a rare instance, I believe, where the Gemara and the Targum, so to speak, coincide. The Gemara says, I arrowed exactly where in the Gemara this is. How do you know that a woman should not go out with weapons to wartime? Rashi says something very important. Rashi says, really? A woman is not allowed to bear arms? Says Rashi, that would explain that why when Yael was confronted or had the opportunity to knock off the general of the army, Sisera, it doesn't say she took a sword. She didn't take a spear. What did she do? She stretched out her hand to grab the peg. Why wouldn't she take an ordinary weapon? The answer is, it was prohibited for her to take an ordinary weapon. She would have been in violation of Loisil Bashisha Bigdei Ish. Therefore, says Rashi, V'zeh shematzinu b'yael eishes chever akeni shaloi haragasai l'sisra b'kli zayin. She didn't kill him with arms. Ella kamay shenemar yada liyased tishlachna. She stretched forth her hand again to the peg. So interestingly, this is what I spoke out before, that the Rabbi Kiva Eger on this Gemara points out that the teaching of Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov says the Golyon Hashas, that's Rabbi Kiva Eger, v'chein hu b'targum sham. Targum explains the pasuk in the same way. I think it's of note to point out, what Rabbi Kiva Eger's job is to tell us what the Targum says. Well, usually the Golyon Hashas, which are the glosses of Rabbi Kiva Eger, would point out a source, a maramakim, that you would not ordinarily have thought of in your own reading of the Gemara. Rabbi Kiva Eger's contribution here, I believe, is that he's pointing out that this drasha of Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov is the same interpretation as Targum Unklas, meaning this is not typical for the Gemara to interpret the pasuk the way the Targum interprets the pasuk. Okay, so we're learning a woman cannot bear arms. But what if it's what we call Melchemes Mitzvah? What if it's a war to defend Eretz Yisrael, to defend the Jewish people from an enemy in the land of Israel? What if it's a Melchemes Mitzvah? So now I understand the woman ordinarily is now to bear arms, but what if we need her to defend the Jewish people or to defend the land of Israel? So take a look in the Mishnah and Saita, Mem Daled Amud Beis, I believe it's page 3. It says the Gemara on the 4th line, Bamed Dvar Ma'amurim b'Melchemes Harashus. When do we say that, so to speak, there's limited enrollment in the army? That's if it's a discretionary war. Aval b'Melchemes Mitzvah. But if it's a war which we're commanded to wage. Now, what would be an example of a war that we're commanded to wage? For example, to conquer the 7 nations, or to defend the Jewish people from an oncoming enemy. Says the Mishnah, Hakol Yoitzin, everyone goes out to war. Afilu Chasan Mechedroi, even the groom, he's wearing the coat, the trench coat, and the kittel. He's got everything. He's wearing a trench coat, they took off his cufflinks, they put the ashes on his head, he's rearing to go. The Masada Kedushin is standing there, the photographer is there. Photographer said, hey, Chassan, you're not going anywhere. No, he got word that there's a Melchemes Mitzvah. The Chassan is going to leave the chuppah. The Kala mechupasa. The Kala is going to leave the chuppah. What do you mean the Kala is going to leave the chuppah? For what? For Melchemes Mitzvah? Well, what's she going to do in a Melchemes Mitzvah if she can't pick up a gun or she can't lift a rifle? So isn't the Mishnah seem to say that if it's a Melchemes Mitzvah, that a woman is allowed to don arm? Otherwise, what's she leaving the chuppah for a Melchemes Mitzvah for? So the Mishnah seems to indicate there are circumstances when a woman is allowed to bear arms. So let's say, for instance, in the war against Amalek, does a woman wage war against Amalek? We know there's a big tumult and commotion. Parsha Zachar. Do women go to shul for Parsha Zachar? We know what women do, but the question is, do women have to go to shul for Parsha Zachar? Well, what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is to remember to do what to Amalek? Just to remember, or the mitzvah is to remember to destroy Amalek? How do you destroy Amalek? By writing on the bottom of your shoe the word Amalek. You destroy Amalek with weapons. So would there be a reason for a woman to go to shul for Parsha Zachar if the entire mitzvah is to eradicate Amalek with weapons? Can a woman pick up a weapon to actually destroy Amalek? That's why the Sefer HaChinuch says that the mitzvah of Zechiras Amalek, mitzvah 603, on page 4, V'noiheges mitzvah zu b'chol makoim u'v'chol zman, the mitzvah of eradicating and remembering what Amalek did applies in all places and in all times, b'zecharim, for males. Ki lohem lasos hamachama, because males go to war. V'nikmas ha'oyev, and they take revenge against the enemy. V'loy l'nashim, women don't go to war. Therefore, the Sefer HaChinuch says women are exempt from the mitzvah of Zechiras Amalek. According to Sefer HaChinuch, should women go to shul for Parsha Zachar? If they want to. but there's no obligation, there's no halachic obligation for a woman to go to shul because they're not commanded in the mitzvah of Zechiras Amalek. That is the opinion of the Sefer HaChinuch. Comes the Minchas Chinuch and he says, where did the Chinuch get this from that women don't go to war? Why? Because they can't pick up arms, but the Mishnah says in Soita that even a chassan from his chuppah or a kala from her chuppah will leave the chuppah to go to war. Now Melchemes Amalek is a Melchemes mitzvah. And the Mishnah says that a woman would leave her canopy, would leave her chuppah to go to war. So why wouldn't she go to war against Amalek? Therefore the Minchas Chinuch says, in my opinion, women are obligated in the mitzvah to destroy Amalek, and therefore women have to remember to destroy Amalek, and women do need to go to shul to hear Parsha Zachar. So the Chinuch, who was a Rishain, says they're exempt. The Minchas Chinuch, who wrote a sefer of Pilpul, says they're obligated. By the way, he says further, who says the reason to remember what Amalek did is in order to eradicate them? Maybe there's just an independent chayk in the Torah that we can never forget what Amalek did, and even when Mashiach comes and Amalek is destroyed, perhaps there will still be a mitzvah to remember what they did. The opinion of the Minchas Chinuch is, based on the Mishnah and Saita, that women indeed would be obligated to destroy Amalek, and if there's a Melchemes mitzvah, they would have to go to war, and the only way to go to war would be to pick up arms, and even though there's a lav in the Torah of Leisilbash, for Melchemes mitzvah, the women will have to do what they have to do, they'll have to pick up arms. So the question is, what does the Sefer HaChinuch do with this Mishnah and Saita, that the Mishnah seems to say that a kala will leave her chuppah to go to war, a Melchemes mitzvah, but the Sefer Chinuch says women are not obligated in that. So the Rashash says something that is not politically correct, and whatever is being said at this year does not necessarily reflect the views of the Jewish Heritage Center. However, I will say that the Jewish Heritage Center, since this is my last shir here, this Yom Tif, the Jewish Heritage Center does tremendous work on Long Island and makarev hundreds and thousands of Jews, and whatever we could do to help support them, tavei aleichem bracha. But again, the following view does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Jewish Heritage Center. The Rashash says, just because the Mishnah says the kala will leave her chuppah to go to war, the man leaves the chuppah to go to war with a rifle and a gun, and the woman leaves the chuppah to cook for the man who's going to be holding the gun. In other words, the man does what he needs to do, and the woman has her role in helping at the war front, but it does not include bearing arms. Why? A woman may not bear arms. That's considered a male accessory. That's what the Rashash says. But that is also the opinion of the Radvaz. By the way, I want to share with you something very important. The Radvaz was the rabbi in Cairo for over 40 years. He wrote more than 2,500 shuvais. The Radvaz noticed in his time something very interesting that had begun in the times of the Rambam. You know, in the times of the Rambam noticed that during Chazaras Hashatz, people were learning, which you're not allowed to do during Chazaras Hashatz. During Chazaras Hashatz, you have to be paying attention to the words. Chazaras Hashatz, halachically, is considered, even though the Shulchan Aruch says it's a tefillah for someone who's not proficient, so one may think, I know how to daven, I don't need to pay attention to Chazaras Hashatz. But actually, Chazaras Hashatz is considered tefillas hatzibor. It's the tefillah of the tzibor. To the point where the Mekubalim write, the Chazaras Hashatz is a more powerful tefillah even than the Silent Shemona Esrei. So the Mishnah Berurah says you cannot learn during Chazaras Hashatz. They even went to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. They said, what should somebody who was Maver Sedra during Chazaras Hashatz do? Reb Chaim said, no problem, he should just do it again. Because he's not Yotzei. It's a mitzvah haba ba'avera. I once had the situation where I saw a guy, he finished Shas during Chazaras Hashatz, and then he made a siyum during the 9 days. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? It's a problem, you know? So I gave a shir on that. It's called the Siyum Hashas that never happened. Okay? The Rambam noticed that people weren't paying attention during Chazaras Hashatz. So you know what the Rambam did? Do you know that he abolished the silent Shemona Esrei? He didn't abolish Chazaras Hashatz. He abolished the silent Shemona Esrei. it was not reintroduced to the Jewish people for quite a while, for a few hundred years, until the Radvaz reintroduced the silent Shemona Esrei. Anyway, the Radvaz was the Rebbe of the Arizal. The Radvaz was the Rebbe of the Shita Mikubetzes. The Radvaz also says, the fact that the Mishnah says in Saita that the woman leaves the chuppah to the war front, it doesn't mean she leaves the chuppah to the war front to pick up arms. It means she leaves the chuppah, because if he's not standing under the chuppah, imagine this, the photographer is there, the chassan booked, he's running to the war front in his kittel, in his trench coat, without his cufflinks. What's she supposed to do? Stand there? Till when? The photographer is going to be taking pictures of her in the next 7 days? So she also leaves the chuppah. But she's not going to war. She leaves the chuppah because it would be ridiculous for her to stand under the chuppah while he's not there. But of course she doesn't go to war. Or the Radvaz says she goes and she provides water for the warriors. She provides food for them. And until today, says the Radvaz, the minhag of the Arabs are the men go to war and the women cook. So why should we be any different, says the Radvaz. That's the opinion of the Rashash and the Radvaz. In other words, the Mishnah in Soita is not conclusive that women may bear arms for Melchemes Mitzvah. The lav of Leisilbash would dictate that even for Melchemes Mitzvah, a woman cannot bear arms. Now, this is very interesting. Let's pause for a moment and think. Why would a woman not be allowed to bear arms for a Melchemes Mitzvah? Wouldn't this be like a classic case of asay doicha lois asay? You have a mitzvah in the Torah to go to war, and you have a prohibition for a woman to bear arms. So why wouldn't you say asay doicha lois asay? There are two approaches to this. Actually, Tzvika Reisman wrote two svarim on very contemporary war ethics of war. And he suggests, based on the Rishonim, that the reason why even for Melchemes Mitzvah a woman would not be allowed to bear arms is just based on a simple Rashi. Rashi, the first Maramakam we read, says, what's the reason for lo yiach li gever alisha v'lo yilbash gever simla asisha? Rashi says, because why would the woman bear arms? What's her intention? Or what's the psychology of a woman bearing arms? This way, by bearing arms, she's more comfortable in male company. And if she's more comfortable in male company, then it will be easier for her to mix in those circles. It can lead to promiscuity. So what does that mean? That means bearing arms is not just a specific lav. It's what we call avazrayu da'arayis. It's, so to speak, the dust of immorality. Now, avazrayu da'arayis, we're not going to apply asay doicha lois asay, which, by the way, would answer a further question. In other words, what if we need the woman to defend the Jewish people? So now it's a matter of Jewish life. Don't we say that all prohibitions in the Torah are, so to speak, pushed away for the sake of Jewish life? Isn't Jewish life considered the paramount value? Why couldn't a woman go to war to protect Jewish life? But if you understand, and that's the way Rashi learns, the Ibn Ezra learns, Rabbeinu Bechai says that the underlying reason of Lo Silbash, it's, in a way, it's a geder of arayos, then we may not apply the value system of, well, it's a Melchemes Mitzvah, asay doicha lois asay, or pikuach nefashos. I think perhaps there's another way to look at this. This I never said before, but I present it for your consideration. There's another Minchas Chinuch. Minchas Chinuch famously asks, there are only 3 averos in the Torah you have to give up your life for. Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayis, Shvichas. There are 3 cardinal sins. So he asks, but how could anybody go to war to protect the Jewish people? How are you allowed to going to war is just a mitzvah. But how are you allowed to risk your life to fight in a war? That's not one of the things that you have to give up your life for. That's not one of the things that are yehareg v'al yavar. So how could anybody enter the army, so to speak, and defend the Jewish people? But fighting a battle on behalf of the Jewish people are not one of the 3 cardinal things that you could give up your life for. So Minchas Chinuch says, well, wait a second. That's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is going to war. Nobody goes to war in a situation where they're perfectly secure. The very definition of war is risking your life. So if the Torah gives a mitzvah of Melchemes Mitzvah, then inherent in that mitzvah, what is the mitzvah of going to war? The mitzvah of going to war is you go to war to defend or to conquer at the risk of personal safety. That is the mitzvah. It's not Yehareg ve'al yavar. The mitzvah of going to war entails risking your life. The prohibition of lo yia kli gever alisha. The prohibition is not that a woman is not to wear male clothing. That's not how Targum reads the pasuk. That's not how the Gemara reads the pasuk. The prohibition is a woman can't take up arms. Now, what does that mean, a woman can't take up arms? That means she can't go to war. When do you take up arms? If the Torah says clearly a woman can't take up arms, that means the Torah is saying when there's a war, a woman cannot take up arms and go to war. So that is the lav. The lav is, irregardless, respective of the circumstance, because typically the situation of war is such that you're needed to defend the lives of other people, and yet the Torah still says you're not allowed to do it. So the first question, so to speak, that we have to discuss, halach l'maisa, is, can a woman enlist in the army, whether it's the American army, the Israeli army? Because inherent in that is that she would have to take up arms. Would that be permitted for a woman? A woman says, you know what, I want to do something for my people. I want to make a contribution to Klal Yisrael. I want to stand up for Eretz Yisrael. Can a woman enter the army if that's going to mean taking up arms? So says the Tzitz Eliezer, she can't do it. Why can't she do it? It's a lav in the Torah. She can't lift up a gun. She can't lift up a rifle. She can't have a pistol. She cannot take a weapon to fight a war. Rabbi Victor Nebenzal, I don't have it on the sheet. I couldn't get a hold of Techumen, the 5th volume, page 364. Rabbi Victor Nebenzal points out, very interestingly, there are 2 times in the Chumash the Jewish people are counted. Once in year 2, Ma'aloischa, and once in year 40 as they're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. In both circumstances, they're being counted because they're about to go to war. And in both circumstances, only the men are counted. Why are only the men counted? Because only the men are going to war. That means the Torah is emphasizing that Jewish war means only the men are fighting. Rabbi Victor Nebenzal points out the war against Amalek. The pasuk says, "B'char lanu anoshim," take men. And the Gemara says the word anoshim is extra. So Victor Nebenzal says, why is the word extra? Don't we need it to say men and not women? So Victor Nebenzal says, no, it's extra. We don't need the pasuk to say men and not women. We know already men and not women. Because how could a woman fight in a war in the first place? There's a prohibition of lo silbash isha. And therefore, Rabbi Victor Nebenzal says, it is not permitted for a woman to enlist in any army. It would be a violation of lo silbash. So that's the first, so to speak, step of the shir. The question of whether a woman could bear arms and act as a soldier in an army, halachically, it would not be permitted, whether it's Milchemes Rishus or whether it's Milchemes Mitzvah. What about, could a woman bear arms for self-defense? Maybe she lives over the Green Line. Maybe she lives in New York. Those are the 2 most dangerous places in the world. Is that considered a prohibition of lo silbash isha? So we have a very interesting tshuva from Rabbi Moshe. It's on page 9. This is found in Chelek Daled, Siman Ayin Hey, Ois Gimel. The shoyel, this tshuva was written in 1980. The shoyel was Rav Moshe's grandson-in-law, Rav Shabsi Rappaport. And the question is, there's a woman who lived in Gush Etzion, and the path from Gush Etzion to where she was going was fraught with great danger. And there were snipers there, and it wasn't always possible to have IDF accompaniment. And the question is, could the woman bear arms for self-defense? She's not fighting in the war. She's just carrying a gun in case her life is in peril. So the shoyel, Rav Shabsi Rappaport, assumed that if it's a question of pikuach nefashos, she could do it. Now you should know, that's not so simple. According to the logic we said that it might be an issue of avuzrayu da'arayos. Now I want to point out something in contemporary society. You know, daya l'chakima baramiza. many Rishonim say that if a woman's going to carry a gun, she might come to war, because the mir, and if she comes to war, she'll mingle in male company, and that's a form of immorality. But the Rishonim use a language that a woman merely carrying a gun is ma'orer arayos. And in the world of entertainment, in contemporary entertainment, one of the ways that they try to elicit people to watch is they'll always have a woman with a weapon, because the mere image of such a thing, it elicits taiva. That's one of the attractions of modern entertainment. So, without getting too descriptive, that's the svar that the Rishonim say that there's an issue of lois silbash. Okay, so Reb Shapsi Rappaport offered the following logic, that perhaps it should be mutter for a woman to carry a gun for self-defense based on a shach and a bach, a very interesting shach and a bach. The shach and the bach both say that the isser of a man wearing a woman's accessory, or a woman wearing a man's accessory, is only if you're wearing it for an adornment. But let's say you're wearing it to protect you from the sun or from the cold, it's permitted. Okay, I'll give you a perfect example. You're going to shul, you open up the front closet, and even though you've already bought 19 shena coats, they're all lost. None of them are left in the closet. But sure enough, your wife's shena coat is in the closet. Are you allowed to put on your wife's shena coat? After all, if it could cover a sheitel, and if it could protect the sheitel, alachas kama v'kama, it could protect the borsalino, because as expensive as a borsalino is, okay. Could you put on your wife's shena coat when it's raining? And the answer is, I believe yes. That's what the shach and the bach say, that you can't wear a woman's adornment or clothing if you're wearing it as an accessory or an adornment. But if you're doing it to protect you from the sun or the cold or the rain, it's permitted, because you're not using it as an adornment, you're using it to protect yourself. So therefore, says Reb Shapsi Rappaport, asking Reb Moshe, if you're allowed to wear a woman's garb not as an accessory but for an ulterior reason, then you should be allowed to carry a gun, because you're not carrying it as an adornment. If the woman wanted to carry it because she wanted to look like a guy in a cowboy movie, so then she can't do it. But if the reason she's doing it is for self-protection, then it should be mutter based on the shach and the bach. And Rav Moshe said that his grandson, you misinterpreted the shach and the bach. Why? When it comes to an article of clothing, the halacha is it's permitted to wear it as long as it's not an accessory if you're using it to protect you from the cold or from the rain or for something else. So, however, when it comes to a gun, there is no heter that if you're using it for self-protection, you're allowed to. Listen very carefully. When it comes to a garment is only prohibited if you're using the garment as an accessory, not if you're using it for protection. But a weapon, says Rav Moshe, a weapon is inherently a male tool. A woman cannot hold it under any circumstance, even for self-protection. So for the shach and the bach, it would not, from the shach and the bach, there is no legitimate heter. Because Rav Moshe understands that there are two categories. There's a category of clothing. Clothing is only prohibited if you wear it as an accessory, and then there's a category of a weapon. A weapon is prohibited even as not as an accessory, just inherently. But says Rav Moshe, mamish and einfa, Rav Moshe has a chidush why it would be permitted for a woman to carry a weapon for self-defense. You ready for this? You got, after a dinner, a cholmai dinner, it might not be so easy to muster the intellectual focus to get this distinction, but I think you could do it. Says Rav Moshe, you know why a woman cannot carry a weapon? Because carrying a weapon for war is inherently a male item. Because men go to war, and it's not an activity for a woman. However, when it comes to self-defense, self-defense is not more in the realm or in the domain of a man than a woman. Women need self-defense just as much as men need self-defense. Self-defense is not a male activity. Self-defense is a universal activity. Therefore, says Rav Moshe, if you're carrying a gun for war, that only a man could carry, a woman can't carry. But if you're carrying a gun for self-defense, self-defense is not relegated to the domain of the male as opposed to the female. Therefore, says Rav Moshe, in any circumstance, a woman's in a dangerous neighborhood, she wants to carry a gun, a knife, mace, or whatever else people carry, a BB gun. A woman could carry any weapon for self-defense. Self-defense is not relegated to the domain of a man. War is only relegated to the domain of the male. That is the chidush of Rav Moshe. Interestingly, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef has a tshuva where he concurs with the Shoyel and the Igros Moshe. In other words, he does read the Shach and the Bach the way Rav Moshe's grandson read it, namely, that the same way you could wear your wife's shena coat to protect you from the rain, as long as you're not wearing it as an adornment, if you're wearing it for protection, it's permitted to wear the other gender's garb. So too when it comes to a weapon, as long as you're not carrying it for the sake of an adornment, you're carrying it for the sake of protection, it would be mutter. The Talmidei Rabbi Ovadia write that according to Rabbi Ovadia, if a woman's going to carry a gun for self-defense, she shouldn't carry it on a holster. Because wearing it on a holster, that's like a man's adornment. Instead, she should put it in her pocketbook. Okay? That's there's a sefer, Baruch Oimer, on the Abia Oimer. He says that the way Rabbi Ovadia reads the Shach and the Bach, that it would be permitted for a woman to carry a gun for self-defense because it's analogous to wearing a woman's raincoat to protect you from the rain. Even so, she should carry it, so to speak, b'derech ha'isha and not b'derech ha'ish. So what would you say about the following case? There was a woman, she was a Balas Tshuva, she was looking for a job. She couldn't find a job as a graphic designer. She couldn't find a job as an accountant. She had a job availability as a security guard. And to be a security guard, you need to carry a gun. Can a woman get a job as a security guard? What would you say about that case? She's not going to war. Is she going to war? Is that called self-defense? Or is that not called self-defense? So there's an article in Techumin where many poskim say, the same way that Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Victor Nebenzahl say a woman can't go to war, she can't bear arms to go to war because that's derech ha'ish, and that's inherently considered a male activity, and therefore she would not be able to bear arms to go to war. She wouldn't be able to take a job as a security guard. But I think based on the way we're understanding it, and there's a tshuva from Rav Mordechai Gross, who was asked this question, could a woman get a job as a security guard? He says, and I believe, extends the rationale of Rav Moshe. See, Rav Moshe said, war is inherently the domain of a male. Self-defense is a universal domain. All mankind needs self-defense. What would you say about security? So on the one hand, you could say, it's universal. Security is a universal need. The only thing is providing security, being the one to provide the security. It's not clear that that is universally provided. But there seems to be basis that a woman could get a job as a security guard. Like I said in the beginning of the shir, Rabbi Turk, I mentioned that all the views presented in tonight's shir do not necessarily reflect the views of the Jewish Heritage Center. And this is my last shir here over Chalamayit. It's been a pleasure being together with you for Yom Tif. And everyone who's come to this program, aside from having a beautiful experience, also showed chizuk to the great work of the Jewish Heritage Center, and whatever you could do to be machazik them in any capacity. Tavay aleichem bracha. Thank you very much. Agut Mayed.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What about Yael, who basically had relations with his sister? So what